Today, we're diving into a mystery that honestly feels like it's been ripped straight out of some lost history book. We're talking about the story of an entire, advanced empire that, according to some, has been systematically wiped off the face of the Earth. So let's start with this question, because it's the big one. What if a civilization, vaster, and maybe even more advanced than we can imagine, wasn't just forgotten over time, but was deliberately erased from our maps, our books, and our collective memory?
All right, so where do we even begin with a claim that big? Well, our investigation starts with the most tangible piece of evidence proponents point to: old maps. This is really where the whole story begins to take shape.
The difference here is just wild. For over 300 years, you have map makers. We're talking respected cartographers from France, the Netherlands, Germany, all of them consistently drawing this massive territory called Tartaria all over Asia. Then, poof, it's just gone. Today, there's no trace. Now, of course, mainstream historians will tell you Tartary was just a kind of catch-all term for a part of Asia that was poorly understood by Europeans, not a single unified empire. But theorists, they push back and ask, could such a consistent, massive feature on maps just be a placeholder?
And that's the question, isn't it? How does an empire that was a fixture on world maps for centuries just disappear? If the land was there, if the cities were there, where did they all go? Let's move on to the next clue, because this is where the theory really starts to build.
So the next piece of this giant puzzle, according to theorists, is the architecture. Right around the same time Tartaria was vanishing from the maps, these magnificent, almost impossible-looking buildings were popping up all over the world, especially at the Great World's Fairs. Think about this number for a second. Just 2 years. That's the official timeline they give us for building the massive 1893 Chicago World's Fair. I mean, imagine it. This sprawling white city covering more than 600 acres, filled with these incredible structures that would be a challenge for engineers today, and we're told it was all built in just 24 months. For theorists, that timeline just doesn't add up. And this really gets to the heart of the skepticism. The official story is that these grand halls were all temporary, made of plaster and fiber, built just for the fair and then torn down. But proponents of the theory, they just say, hey, look at the photos, you decide. Do these look like temporary throwaway buildings to you? So you have two completely different stories here. The official one, which is backed up by construction records, says they were temporary marvels built from a material called staff and then demolished. But the theorist claim is much more startling, that these were actually pre-existing Tartarian buildings, that they were just repurposed for the fairs and then deliberately destroyed to hide the evidence of a lost civilization.
And this leads to another point. This architectural style, it wasn't just in Chicago. Theorists point out that you see the same ornate domes, the same classical columns, and that same precise stonework on buildings from San Francisco all the way to St. Petersburg. They argue that this points to a single global civilization as the origin, not a bunch of different local builders all having the same idea at once.
Okay, and this is where the mystery really deepens. The theory proposes that this empire wasn't just erased from maps, it was literally buried. So let's take a look at the evidence for what followers of this theory call the Great Mud Flood.
So, the Great Mud Flood. This is the name they've given to a supposed cataclysmic event in the 1800s. The idea is that a single, massive disaster buried the lower levels of Tartarian cities across the entire globe, essentially hiding them right under our feet.
So once again, you see these two conflicting explanations. Mainstream history tells us that street levels rise gradually over time. You repave a road here, add new construction there. It's a slow process you can see in ancient cities like Rome. But proponents of the theory ask, does that really explain entire floors of buildings being uniformly buried, seemingly all at the same time, all over the world? And this is really the challenge the theory poses. Can a few inches of asphalt every decade really account for windows sitting at sidewalk level, or for first floors suddenly becoming basements? And not just in one city, but in cities across different continents, all dating back to the same general era that Tartaria supposedly vanished.
So if this civilization did exist, who were they? Well, this is where the theory takes a pretty fascinating leap. Proponents suggest they weren't just technologically advanced, they might not have even been quite like us.
Believers in this theory will point to things like star forts, and they'll claim that perfect geometric shapes weren't for defending against cannonballs, but for harnessing and manipulating energy. They'll suggest that grand cathedrals were actually gigantic resonance chambers, using sound for some kind of technological purpose. And the whole thing, they say, culminated in the mastery of free energy to power their entire civilization.
Now, to explain the massive scale of their architecture,
We're talking about doorways that are 20 feet high. The theory proposes that the Tartarians were in fact giants. Proponents point to oversized furniture seen in old photos, and these widespread 19th century newspaper reports about giant skeletons being dug up. Now, archaeologists often explain these reports as misidentified animal bones or just straight-up hoaxes, but theorists see them and all the global myths about giants as a kind of lingering cultural memory.
And we're not talking just a little bit taller here. Some of these newspaper articles and old institutional records from the 1800s were reporting the discovery of skeletons measuring 7, 8, even up to 9 feet tall.
So, if a technologically advanced civilization of giants did exist, what on earth happened to them? This brings us to the climax of the theory, a deliberate, violent, and total cover-up of history.
Theorists call this the Great Reset. And no, not the modern economic idea you might have heard of. They're talking about a much older, much more sinister event, a coordinated campaign to destroy the last remnants of the Tartarian civilization and completely rewrite history to exclude them. Mainstream history, of course, sees all these as separate, tragic events. But the theory lays them out on a timeline and asks, is this really a coincidence? Were these just random disasters, or were they targeted attacks, designed specifically to wipe out the remaining Tartarian infrastructure and populations? That's the really unsettling question at the heart of this whole final chapter. From the theorists' point of view, events like the Great Chicago Fire, which seem to strangely target the most ornate, beautiful buildings, start to look less like accidents and more like a systematic demolition project. And the last piece of visual evidence they offer is this: these really haunting photographs from the late 1800s. They show major cities like London and Paris with these magnificent, totally finished buildings, but the streets are eerily empty. The theory suggests these are actually pictures of a world that has just been repopulated after a massive cataclysm.
So, at the end of the day, we're left with this compelling but, let's be honest, deeply controversial picture. Is this all just a grand misunderstanding of history, of old maps and urban development? Or is it possible we're looking at evidence of a lost chapter of our past, one that was deliberately torn out of the books? What do you think really happened to the Tartarian Empire?